Hey everyone, happy International Women's Day. Look, I can explain. I was going to try and wear a wig in order to celebrate this very special day, but the wig didn't come in the mail on time. It took longer than expected to get ready. So now I'm left with just a bald head, and my attempt to celebrate International Women's Day was ruined, all because something took longer than expected to get ready.
That's right, today we're going to be talking about women, more specifically their connection to and impact on the horror genre, which is really quite significant. It can't be understated how much women have shaped many of the most well-known and beloved films in this category, which is why I would even go so far as to call horror the most feminist film genre there is. Now that may be seen as a loaded statement, as many horror films horrifically exploit and use women either to gain notoriety, shock the viewer, or simply because the creator was a sick individual. I am absolutely not trying to whitewash the malice behind those films which, let's be honest, are numerous beyond the point of being relegated to just a few bad apples. There are entire subgenres that are almost entirely constructed upon this nonsense, so it's definitely an endemic issue.
Each genre contains multitudes of good and bad, moral and immoral, but with all of that in mind, I would still consider horror to be the most pro-woman genre of film. But why is that? Well, for starters, we need to take a look at one of the most common tropes/character archetypes in all of horror, namely, the final girl.
Beyond being the name of an amazing song and a horror comedy that in and of itself is hilarious, final girls can be found all over horror, and though they've appeared in more diverse ways in the past few years, the vast majority can be summed up as a virtuous, morally correct young woman who serves the role of evil's ultimate antithesis. Whether it be the soft-spoken, likable, and intelligent Laurie Strode fighting the so-soft-spoken he's silent, purely devilish Michael Myers in Halloween, a whole assortment of camp counselor virgins facing off against Jason Voorhees, or the legendary Ellen Ripley kicking some xenomorph ass, this troupe runs through nearly every famous horror franchise and informs a lot of the genre even to this day.
As I mentioned, an entire film was made poking fun at this concept, and just as cars seeming to never start and characters making incredibly dumb decisions, one last female victim fighting for survival and defeating the enemy is one of the most common traits of horror films that any Scream viewer could point out to you.
There are definitely exceptions to this, and we don't want to forget Scream Kings like Ash from Evil Dead, Tommy Jarvis's 3 wildly different iterations and body types, or Arnold Schwarzenegger in the original Predator, but we really should ask ourselves, why does it always seem to be a woman in the spotlight? In many other genres, there are great female-led films that seek to empower women. Okay, well actually good ones that successfully do so are kind of few and far between, but there are many attempts to achieve this across the world of cinema nowadays. But back in the 70s, 80s, hell, even 90s, you'd be hard-pressed to find one that wasn't in the horror genre.
I mean, I seriously am struggling to think of a single example. I guess G.I. Jane? By the way, when's the sequel to that coming out? You know, Hollywood's resurrected every single corpse of a franchise in the past 5 years. Why not that one?
But ever since 1974 with Black Christmas and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we've had various strong female characters take survival into their own hands and fight against villains often meant to represent pure evil. It should be noted that while more representation is undoubtedly a good thing, and many examples of final girls do a great job of making powerful, memorable, and three-dimensional characters like Ripley, there's also a less savory side to this. Some may take issue with the constant depiction of women as victims in the first place, but I don't innately see this as a problem, as it's really quite realistic. Women do tend to be the victims of these sorts of crimes far more often. However, when it's presented almost like a referendum on the character's morality, things can get a bit iffy. Take, for example, Friday the 13th, where the crazed perspective of Miss Voorhees from the first movie essentially became the narrative from which the rest of the franchise operated. That is to say, her hatred of the counselors who did drugs and had sex while her son drowned developed into Jason's motives in the later entries, causing the movies to almost seem like they sought to intertwine virginity and morality.
However, I think that's the message that would really only be relayed to extremely imperceptive viewers because, like I said, Jason is a killer with his own motivations, and even though we as an audience might sometimes have a sick urge to root for him and see him cause some entertaining carnage, that does not mean that the filmmakers endorse what he does at all, obviously. It's difficult to quantify and it's definitely up for debate, but I would overall say that the final girl trend has had a pretty positive impact on female representation in films, as it made many closed-minded men reconsider their perceptions of women as flat, objectifiable characters and see them for the complex individuals that they are.
There are certainly examples as well of actresses being mistreated on film sets, such as Sandra Peabody in The Last House on the Left, and the bro culture of 2000s horror films sticks out as a shameful mark on the genre's legacy, at least in my opinion. Many series like Friday the 13th were always sexually charged, but there seemed to be a more exploitative undercurrent behind them at the turn of the century. However, this was swiftly countered by a forceful retaliatory movement of new feminist horror, which is, in my view, the solidifying piece of evidence behind my initial theory. I'd say that Alien and Silence of the Lambs stick out as the two best early examples of feminist horror films, both functioning as landmarks for depictions of women in film, but it's quite noticeable that the rate at which such movies are produced has increased steeply in the past 2 decades. There are more iconic examples like Midsommar, which I think is best described as the female equivalent of Joker, or the X trilogy, which poses the interesting question, if we support women's rights, do we also support women's wrongs?
But beyond that, it's staggering how many horror movies fall into the subgenre of essentially just men. Basically, movies that seek to show the horror of being a woman and having to interact with men, whether they be violent psychopaths condemned by society or seemingly normal individuals who slip past undetected, or possibly even men who are rewarded for their horrible, violent actions against women with wealth, popularity, fame, and power, something that remains incredibly relevant to this very day.
3 movies that I've seen over the past year or two really stuck out to me in this category, namely Men, Watcher, and Woman of the Hour. Men is the clearest example of a movie belonging to the men's subgenre for obvious reasons, and I found it to be an incredibly striking and effective depiction of women's struggles, specifically with how it uses multiple different characters, all of them representative of common masculine archetypes, to drive a protagonist into a spiral of danger and entrapment. The fact that they're all played by the same guy, too, is incredibly impressive, and I didn't even notice it until someone pointed it out to me. And the finale is one of the most horrific and gross things I've ever seen, but somehow also simultaneously breathtaking in its wit and meaningfulness.
Before I go any further, let me point out the obvious that I am not a woman, so I cannot speak to how well these movies portray the experiences of women, but looking at them purely from how they use filmmaking techniques to relay their messages and the feelings of their main characters, it's incredibly effective and quite remarkable.
Watcher is a similar story, though not supernatural whatsoever, and a lot less brutal. This is more of a thriller, but a very interesting one with a great atmosphere of isolation, which I think is also an important aspect of Men, and to a smaller extent, the third film as well. It's that feeling of imprisonment that comes across incredibly well, which I find fascinating. The general human fear of being held captive and mistreated by a monster or a human psychopath is perpetuated by these movies, however made significantly more potent by the additional confinement experienced by women in their day-to-day lives, not due to some extraordinarily cruel occurrence, but as a mere result of the existing patriarchal societal order. And finally, Woman of the Hour tells the fascinating real story of the dating show killer Rodney Alcala, depicted in the film in an incredibly effective and unsettling fashion, with many harrowing scenes showing his previous victims coinciding with the main story about him winning a dating show. This movie does an amazing job taking us back to the 70s and showing us the way things were for women at the time, making clear once again that the horrors of everyday life function as a noteworthy layer in the experiences of these female protagonists, deepening the scope of their suffering beyond one standout struggle.
I think all of these examples, both in the new wave of feminist horror and the more old-fashioned final girl concept, showcase what I'm trying to say.
Horror may have a grotesque underbelly of films that mistreat female characters or even the actors that portray them behind the scenes, but there's a strong argument to be made that due to its consistent status as a more underground, anti-status quo genre, horror has usually been on the cutting edge when it comes to advancing women's rights and fighting sexism in media.
Maybe you disagree with me completely, in which case I'd love to know why, or you have even more examples of why you also think horror is the most feminist genre of movie. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. This has been Terror Time, so keep on terrifying till time tends to terminate, and goodbye.